Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsay, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of SuperPsyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. SuperPsyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. I'm guessing you've worked with leaders who inspired you. I'd also guess you've worked with leaders who infuriated you. What are the traits of each type of leader? Turns out there are 3 traits of each type, and they transcend geographic boundaries. The traits are universally enjoyed or deplored. And these traits aren't present solely at work. They exist in all domains of our lives. Dr. Adam Galinsky is a social psychologist, professor, and dean at the Columbia Business School. He's also the author of a book I loved called Inspire, The Universal Path for Leading Yourself and Others. I'm not alone in my love of this book. Dan Pink echoed my thoughts and feelings about it, saying, Inspire is the best book on leadership I've read in many years, a masterful blend of intellectual rigor and practical wisdom. Galinsky's insights will help anyone become an exceptional leader and everyone become a better person. So listen in and learn how we can all lean into the traits of an inspiring leader and avoid those of an infuriating one. Dr. Adam Galinsky, a hearty welcome to SuperPsyched. So
from one atom to another.
From one atom to another. This is such a timely and important book. I can't begin to emphasize how much I loved it. I think this is not just something that leaders need to read. I think this is a book that everybody needs to read because on some level, this book speaks to our everyday interactions on some level, varying degrees. I would love it if you could describe the difference just from the get-go of an inspiring versus an infuriating leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the kind words and for asking that question. It's so funny. I was just teaching a group of FBI agents literally almost 20 years ago in 2006. And one of them described an inspiring leader. And I stopped my teaching and I just asked, do each of you have someone in your life that you would call an inspiring leader, someone that inspired you? And they all did. And I asked them to describe the person. I started doing that. And then the next time, I taught the FBI, someone said, well, I want to tell you about someone else. They didn't create this wellspring of hope and possibility in me. They created a seething cauldron of rage and resentment. And that's the person that's even more important. So I started asking people all over the world about their infuriating leader. And part of the reason why I asked both the inspiring and infuriating leader is because cognitive psychology shows that we learn more deeply when we make comparative analysis. And so it sort of made sense to do that. I was so struck immediately by the many examples, realized that the inspiring leader and the infuriating leader were essentially mirror images of each other, right? So the inspiring leader could see the big picture, right? And was optimistic. And the infuriating leader was small-minded and pessimistic, or the infuriating leader was calm and courageous, right? And the infuriating leader was anxious and cowardly, or the inspiring leader was generous and the infuriating leader was selfish or self-focused. And so it really became very clear that they kind of existed on a continuum, if you will. Now, what I just did in describing those differences is I actually tapped into probably the single most important and fundamental insight of my research, which is that it turns out that what distinguishes an inspiring leader and infuriating leader are 3 factors. And those 3 factors are universal. So they exist in every continent, in every culture, in every country in the world. There's not a single inspiring, infuriating trait that is unique to a country. And so that's one of the things. And I can go into each of those 3 things in a minute, but I don't want to go on and on.
I would love that. In fact, what's so interesting to me is when you think about these ubiquitous, if not universal traits, it's simply astounding when you're able to actually just drill into those, because to imagine that these know no borders. So let's get into them. What are the 3 traits of each?
And I'll just say one thing about it. I was teaching this recently and someone came up to me afterwards and said, that was the most intuitive hour I've ever experienced. And I acted a little offended. What I'm saying is obvious. And they're like, I meant that as the greatest compliment, which is that it's so straightforward and simple to follow, but I never thought of it that way before. But it makes sense.
And I find myself thinking about, it was one of the ancient Greek philosophers, either Aristotle or Plato, who basically came up, posited that we were born having forgotten everything.
Right.
And when I hear that intuited, it really calls forth that idea.
Yeah.
One other thing I just need to comment on, just a few moments ago, you're kind of describing the difference between what I've experienced in the corporate world as a mentor versus a tormentor. I worked at one company, the predecessor to Martin Dorner was my tormentor. I did learn a lot from him, but I gained weight. I was pulling out my hair. It was terrible. And I absolutely hated my job. I dreaded Mondays. And as soon as Martin Dorner came on the scene, I had a legitimate inspiring leader, a mentor. Yeah. And I think about that man every day to this day.
It's so funny. I had someone say recently something similar to me, which is, here's what I think is the biggest distinction between an inspiring leader and an infuriating leader, is that I had an infuriating leader and I would go home exhausted, just tired. And I would work 9 to 5 and I didn't even want to go out. I was so exhausted. I just collapsed on the couch. And then I got a new boss. Nothing about my job changed, but I would come in early. I would leave late. I would have more energy. I would go out and do things. It was that difference. When I describe the wellspring, right, of hope and possibility, this energizing, animating experience of being inspired versus infuriating, it's like kind of sucking you down into a hole. And so what are these 3 dimensions? Well, the first dimension is sort of how we see the world, which is how we conceive of it and sort of communicate about it. And I call that being visionary. A second one is how we are in the world, our presence, if you want. I call that being an exemplar of desired behavior. And then the third one, which you just mentioned, is how we interact with others in the world, which is really about being a great mentor. And the reason why these are the 3 universal factors that exist in every culture in the world, and it's not 4 and it's not 2, it's why it's these 3, is because each one satisfies a fundamental human need. So visionary satisfies the fundamental human need for meaning and coherence. Being an exemplar of desired behavior satisfies the fundamental human need for safety and security and propulsion. And then being an inspiring mentor really satisfies these 2 fundamental needs, which are talked so much about in psychology, which is the need for belonging and the need for status, the need to be celebrated by others, but also embraced by others.
What's interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about 2 of the people who have had on very recently, Amy Edmondson out of Harvard, who obviously, and who you talk about in the book, and psychological safety is her baby. And it's been such an important factor in innovation. More psychological safety, the more innovation. It seems to be directly correlated. And I also had Alison Fregal, who I also know you love, talking about status and its importance.
One thing quickly about Amy Edmondson, I was her RA, research assistant, in 1992. She first sent out I actually put all those surveys into packets back in the day that she sent all the hospitals. That was the beginning of her psychological safety research. So I was there from its inception.
That is simply amazing. The thing that really has been showing up in the research, and I know you must know about this, is that the company for whom you work is secondary to the boss you serve. And what I hear about in my office all the time, it's work and love. Freud got this right. Work and love are the primary constituents of life. They're so important. In the pie chart, we're going to spend probably around 90,000 hours of our lives working, and working for someone who is a tormentor or an infuriating leader is just so awful. And I hear about it all the time in my office. And sometimes I can't actually believe what I'm hearing, how people haven't gotten the memo that the inspiring leader is the go-to. Why is it, before we even get into the infuriating leader and all of those traits, what is the red herring that causes leaders to go down the infuriating path? What message have they received and mistaken for the good thing?
I think there's 3 things that I'll say about that. The first is that it's hard to be inspiring. I like to say that life slants us to the infuriating end of the continuum. We're more infuriating, less inspiring when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're angry at someone else. We might accidentally take it out on a third person. when we're under pressure, time pressure, all of these situations like biological deprivations, strong emotions, crises and pressures, being in new contexts, all of them make it more difficult for us to be inspiring. I have a paper coming out that I'm worked on. I'm so proud of. It's one of the best papers I've ever worked on called The Vicious Cycle of Status Insecurity. And what we show is that when people are feeling insecure about their standing, they become self-focused. And what's particularly noxious is ravenously credit claiming. But they get it all wrong because our research shows also, so we have a first half of the paper that shows the insecure don't share, aren't generous with credit. And the second half of the paper, we show that when people do share credit and acknowledge and elevate others, they actually get more status. I call it expanding the status pie. When I acknowledge the contributions of others to my own success, not only do they raise in status, but so do I, because we like generous people. But when we're hungry, when we're tired, all of these things, crisis pressures, they limit our attention and they tend to focus it inward. And so to be inspiring requires that to be visionary, right? You got to expand that thing, but we also got to focus outward on others. And I think that is one of the biggest things. And so we need to learn to train ourselves to handle those situations with the habit of better perspective taking, for example. And as one of the examples, I don't think I mentioned this as much in the book. It's come up a lot more in some of the podcasts I've done, but just as one example, my dad, who I write about in the book, is one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. And he had an incredible, infuriating flaw, which was that he would just release these bursts of fury at the slightest provocation. Literally, I remember this one of these, a joke, it's a metaphor, but it's actually true. It's literal in this case. Is I literally spilled milk at the dinner table and he just flipped out, just screaming and railing at me. So I have now a 7-8-year-old, but let's say they were 2 and 3 at the time, or 1 and 2, and my 2-year-old would spill milk, or he would be stubborn. And just that fury would burst out of me. And I noticed something immediately. He didn't just cry. He would almost collapse to the ground in a fugue state of, I don't know if I'd call it terror, but just not a good place in the world, as if I'd cracked his entire world. And I really, at that moment, I was, I'm my dad. He's coming out of me. And like, that's not a good thing. I trained myself. He had the flu this week. He didn't go to school this week, right? He hasn't been back at school since school started this Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So Thursday is going to go to school day. His fever's over. He's crying. He's screaming this morning. He's yelling at me. And I was just so calm the whole time. I know it's hard. You just want to go back to sleep, but you're ready to go back to school. And my wife especially needed a break from them. And I had to train myself. But here's the thing, and this is where I think there's a root of how we can be more inspiring. I felt so good about myself today. I felt so proud of myself that I was calm. And that made me want to be more calm the next time. And so part of it is that one of the themes of this entire book, and I think it's probably the most important theme that I've sort of now really centralized in my mind, is power of reflection and commitment. And throughout the book, I talk about the reflection we can use to get more visionary, the reflection we can use to be more exemplary. But there's also the reflection, right, that we can do. And then reflection is reflecting, committing, but even when we do well, reflecting that we did well, so that will motivate us to do well the next time.
And you're also speaking about both sides of the equation, reflecting on what you did well, and also reflecting on the unconscious processes, kind of that Jungian quote, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will drive us and we'll think it was fate. I'm also thinking about the tenet from the 12-step program, I believe, HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, don't make decisions then. And you specifically said hungry, angry, and tired. I think that we become far more narcissistic when we are in a self-preservation mode of hungry, angry, lonely, tired, and we have difficulty taking perspectives when we're in any of those states. And you basically lived by, I think it was Ludacris who said, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Check yourself. And you basically said, you know what? The cycle stops here. Of course, I'm in relationship with somebody, my son, a 2-year-old. I did something. It came out of an unconscious place and I attended to it. And I apologize. We will hurt people, The question is, how do we respond after we hurt? And it sounds like you nailed it both externally and internally. So you were probably would fall under the initially an infuriating leader, and then you switched
I was
and pivoted to
super
inspiring.
infuriating, and like those bursts of fury affected my son, but also my wife. She was scared by them. And when I say burst, I mean, we're talking like not a nanosecond, a second or two.
Endless to the recipient.
Yeah, it wasn't like I went on a 15-minute tirade, but it was so strong and so powerful, even if it was 20 seconds. And it was really had a negative effect. Here's another thing that I think is one of the most important things about being more inspiring. And from your perspective as a therapist, I'm sure you will appreciate this as much as anyone. One of the things that I've shown in my research is that shame is a particularly, I would call, destructive emotion. So I've compared shame and guilt. And what I like to say is shame turns us either into ostriches, burying our head in the sand, or defensive monsters. Because shame is really about calling into question the very essence of the self. Whereas when we feel guilty, we're focused on the other person and more reparative behaviors. And so one of the things that I try to tell people is we never reach the inspiring end of the continuum. It is that elusive, I talk about Gatsby's green light. It's that elusive thing that we strive for, but we never quite achieve. And we're always slipping back towards the infuriating end of the continuum. And the way back to the inspiring side is not through shame, to not berate
Absolutely
yourself, not to beat yourself up. You got to accept that you did something wrong, take responsibility, focused on how you can repair that. And if we feel shame for it, that is really just destructive.
Could not agree more. And you're also speaking about holding yourself with self-compassion, which we know is basically if shame could be in a petri dish, according to Brene Brown, and you were to sprinkle on self-compassion or empathy, it would tend to go away. And the notion of turtling or becoming furious is so important because we see these coaches in sports who are lionized for being tough. I'm thinking of one in particular who recently passed, and he was a college basketball coach. And so he had his people for 4 years and he got good results. But I don't believe that had he had players for more than 4 years, that he could have. The great coaches are the Phil Jacksons and the Steve Kerrs of the world, the ones who understand. Steve Kerr on my podcast said that one of the tenets that keeps him winning is compassion. And so you're basically speaking that idea. Two other things, because Adam, you're so provocative to me and evocative in a good way. You're also speaking about something talked about in every religion, and yet it's very hard to do. And that is a good apology. I had Molly Howes on talking about what constitutes a good apology. And it doesn't sound like, I'm sorry if my actions hurt you. It's okay, wow, or I'm sorry you felt that way. But it's really recognizing what you've done. And the second thing that you've done is you are so out there in your book and in this podcast episode with your warts, and you share them. And I can tell that you don't just share them for some type of exhibitionism. It's clearly the result of reflection, and I will do better next time. And I will die an unfinished project.
One of the reasons I talk about Linda Rottenberg in the book, and Linda Rottenberg is CEO of a company called Endeavor, and she wrote a book, Crazy is a Compliment. And I interviewed her for my leadership class, and she's talked a lot about, and I love this distinction she makes between she didn't become an inspiring leader until she stopped being super, I mean, she's incredible at her job, and started being a little bit more human and exposing some of that vulnerability. And in her case, it was her husband's battle with cancer and letting her team know how scared she was. But one of the things, and I mentioned this in the book, is that I almost got kicked out of grad school. And part of it is telling graduate students that story is really important because I think it tells you a couple things. One is, I remember when I got to the Kellogg School of Management in 1999, and I saw a colleague, Vicky Medvik, teach, and I actually thought to myself, I should just go home. I just pack my bags, go home. That is the most incredible teaching I've ever seen.
Oh my God.
And it was only probably 10 years later that I realized she had a lot of experience. She was probably going to be a good teacher day one, but part of it was people just see the finished product. They see me as a professor now, and they don't know the struggles that I had getting there, or they see me teaching. They think, wow, you're a great public speaker. And they don't know that there was periods of time where my hands would shake so much I couldn't even hold the slide clicker. And so part of it is telling people two things, which I think are really important. One is none of us are perfect. It's a struggle, but we all have to find our way. But the second thing is, here's how I found my way, and something in there might help you. However, you should also talk to other people because someone else might have found a way through the difficult path of life and careers through a different mechanism. And so you could try that out. And so listen to 15 different mantras that people use to find the one that works for you, right? Because you don't know which one is going to resonate. That's another theme, which is this concept called diversity, which is a very complicated word, but just variety. And like, as one example, I had a teaching mentor when I first got to Northwestern, a guy named Brian Utz, who's an incredible teacher, won all these awards in a very specific style of teaching. He had all these rings on his finger. People called him Lord of the Rings. And so the first time I taught, I would kind of put my hands together like he did and try to speak. And I felt totally inauthentic, but I thought that's what you had to do to be a good teacher. And then eventually I found, my style. So fast forward 8 years, Lauren Nordgren comes from the Netherlands. He's an American, but he'd been a professor in the Netherlands. He's never taught in America, and he's never taught in a business school. So I'm assigned his mentor. He's supposed to sit in at every one of my classes. Now there's 4 of us who taught leadership at the time at Kellogg. I told him, I said, every week or every day, sit on my class in the morning, but sit on a different person in the afternoon. Sit on Brian for social networks, Vicky for decision-making, and Kathy Phillips for teams. And then he said it was the best thing he ever did. Because if he just watched me, he would have intuitively or instinctively copied me. But because he saw 4 different people with 4 incredibly different styles, all who got 9.5 out of 10 in the ratings, it allowed him to think about what he wanted to do or pick little pieces. And then he taught that next semester and he got a 9.5 out of 10 also. But he wouldn't have done that if he just watched me. So I think another thing that I would say to people is look to many different people to inspire you because you might be able to emulate one of them more effectively than the other.
I think about myself as a budding therapist. I remember saying to a supervisor, is there a book that can teach me how to speak therapy as a second language? I want to be able to sound like a therapist. And same problem for you of wanting to sound like a professor and trying to find your true voice. And the answer, folks, at least for me, and it sounds like for you, is sure, of course, look at what's out there, but also you will find your own version based on who you are. And for me, it turned out, I remember the moment I became a therapist. It was when I said something that was totally authentic during my training, and it just hit hard. This was something that only I would have said, I think. And it involved some humor, used judiciously and appropriately and helpfully, not in any way demeaning the other person. And it was, oh, that's true for me. And it's been a scavenger hunt ever since to collect the pieces that constitute who I am as a therapist. And again, I will die an unfinished project. I will always be curious to see if I can become more of this person that I'm trying to be. I often used to say that I hope to be something like my own version of Jon Stewart in this world. I wanted to be funny and smart. And of course, I am nowhere near the level of Jon Stewart on any of those areas, but I do bring my own version of that. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of becoming an inspiring leader, how can people cultivate those before we get into what an infuriating leader looks like? How can people begin to really incorporate those traits into their own leadership, whether it's at the company or life outside the company, since those traits matter there too?
One thing that is really important is thinking about what's the style that works for us. One of the things I mentioned this earlier, right? The vicious cycle of insecurity, right? Feeling comfortable and secure helps us be our best self, right? And so part of that is finding that authentic style that resonates with ourselves. And I like the phrase to resonate with ourselves. And someone was telling me some analysis was done. I don't think it was ever a published study, but they were trying to figure out what was it about great lawyers speaking to the jury, their closing statements, or bringing everything home. What were the key characteristics that really mattered? And the one thing that didn't seem to matter was style. They said some of the lawyers were thunderous with their language. Others were more calm and methodical as they went through. Some used rhetorical flourishes. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Others just laid out the facts. And so the conclusion of this person who was telling me this, of the lawyer, was It's whatever style worked for that lawyer. How could they be their best self up there? So to go say, you got to use rhymes, it's going to make them feel like an idiot up there. But for other people, rhymes are going to be very helpful. And so one of the things that is true about being visionary is there's two elements that I think are really important. One is simplicity, and the other is being visual, sort of describing something away. And here's a great example that I really love that everyone can put into practice. Research has shown that saying, for example, our goal, our mission is to make our customers happy. That's one. And then here's the alternative that's a little bit more visual. Our goal is to make our customers smile, right? And so you can see that smile, right? You can feel it. And so that resonates. And so research shows if you give people a mission that's more visual, they work harder, they're more creative, the customers rate the products better. So when I tell people what to do is using the word happy versus smile almost doesn't cost anyone anything. It's not going to go against almost anyone's style. And so there's certain things that you can do that are kind of portable across styles versus other ones that are sort of less portable. But so we talked about shame and I just talked about security. And so I think that self-love, you mentioned earlier, feeling good about yourself is one step towards being more inspiring, because when you're not feeling good about yourself, you're compensating, you're defensive, you're focused on the self. One thing I always tell people is in negotiations, I say, never use a tactic that makes you uncomfortable. I've been teaching and studying negotiations for over 20 years, because as soon as you use something that makes you uncomfortable, boom, you're going to be thinking about the thing you did that made you uncomfortable, and you're not going to be paying attention to the person you're negotiating with. You're not going to be seeing the big picture. So that's a part of why it's important to figure out your style, because when you are present with yourself, you're going to be present for other people.
That is so great. I mean, it's entirely cliche, be yourself. What does that mean? But you gave that idea new life in the way that you expressed that. And I think that was fantastic, Adam. Brilliant.
One of the things that I've learned over time is you can be yourself, but you also have to think about what other people need you to be. I'll give you just one example. When I first started teaching, I used to make little political asides in the classroom. I thought they were funny and they're true to who I was as a person, because I was really, especially younger, obsessed with politics and thinking about that. And a student came up to me who was on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum. And he just said, I just want to let you know that every time you make one of those quips, it makes me less engaged in class.
Totally.
And so I realized I actually need to eliminate that from my repertoire. I can make those comments with friends, but like in the classroom, they need me to be a neutral observer, at least on the political domain, in order for everyone to feel engaged. And one of the things that I discovered and things I'm maybe most proud of discovering is something that I call the leadership amplification effect. And it's chapter 1 of the book. You know, that's how important it is. The thing why it's so important is because when you are a leader, everything you say and do gets scrutinized.
Right.
People are paying attention to you. And the reason why I use the word, I could have called it the leader intensification effect, right, would be another word. But we know from psychology research, basic cognitive psychology, that whatever we attend to, that signal gets amplified. But anytime a signal gets amplified that comes through us, our reaction to that signal is going to get intensified. So as one example, a constructive comment, which was a little critical, coming from a leader can become humiliating criticism. But at the same time, a casual compliment can become glorious praise when it comes from a leader. And I think that is one of the things that we have to remember, that when we're a teacher, a therapist, we're on stage essentially, and our behavior is going to have a huge impact on other people. It's not just being a leader. It's anytime someone looks up to us or cares about us, what we say and do is going to matter. It's why I also call something called the apparent amplification effect. These things that we say and do can have transformative effects on people's lives. One of my former PhD students who's at Berkeley now as a professor, when she was 12, both her and her sister Abby played piano, and she just overheard her mom say, oh, both girls are so good at piano, but Abby has a real knack for it. Mm. She was so incensed at the sibling comparison that she never played piano again. Now, her mom didn't know why she quit piano. I actually told her that story at her daughter's graduation, literally 20 years later, and she didn't know it. And so we're always on stage. And so we have to be aware of the impact. So as a therapist, sometimes you like being funny, but you recognize that joke is going to sting too much and it's going to really hurt my client. It's
oh my God, yeah.
But sometimes there's another joke that I can do that can really help them, right? And
can move the
sometimes
along.
You're going to get it wrong, right? And then you realize, okay, I got to do that better that time. I've had situations where twice it's happened in my career at Columbia. I've been here 12 years, where instead of getting near perfect ratings, I got slaughtered in the ratings. Instead of getting 4.7 out of 5, I got 3 out of 5. And in both cases, the same thing happened. He had made a joke, which I thought was very innocuous, but that joke was so upsetting to the student. And the whole class rallied around that student. And I didn't even know about it. 3 months later, I get my evaluations. I'm reading the comments that everyone's like going off on how could I have said this joke to the student and how much it upset her. And I was like, no one told me. So it's hard to find the right balance, but that's what we're trying to do.
I have to go back to one of the statements because I have worked with a leader who I'm positive, and I'm sure many people have worked with similar leaders who felt very good about themselves, but were not the leader people needed. In fact, they were, for lack of a better term, full of hot air. And they were, in fact, damaging, but they definitely felt good about themselves. One of my buddies who's in New Jersey right now, who's probably listening, is saying, oh yeah, I remember the guy you're talking about. And the fact of the matter is, we're never going to be throwing strikes every time. It's a question of strikes to ball ratio and learning where the target is for future reference, just like you did with that 3.5. Yeah. It sounds like you had the ability, you were not so recalcitrant as to say, you know what, that was a joke and they should have just taken the joke. No, you actually softened and said, I'm going to be flexible around this. I want to be the leader they need, not the leader that I think is just the right one. And you seem to internally monitor and externally monitor. And that's really crucial.
You get the teaching evaluations and you see this low rating and you look at the comments, they sting so bad. And here's the way, knowing myself, here's how I do. Some people were like, I don't want anyone to know about this. The way that I do it is I immediately went to my colleague, Rebecca Ponce de Leon's office. And I just got to tell you the story about my ratings. I avoid shame by talking about it with lots of people. But at first I'm defensive and it's hard not to be. I'm that little bit inside that crowd. It was a joke.
The stages of grief as it relates to bad
and then,
feedback.
At some point you come to acceptance. That particular one, it was the joke that I'd used every year for 15 years. And it had never backfired. And I'll tell you what the joke was because it's kind of funny. It's basically, you always have a student who's kind of from American Pie, always, well, this one time at band camp, and so they're always, well, this one time at JP Morgan or this one time at JP Morgan. And so around class 6, I'll pick that student. I'll be like, wait, did you work for JP Morgan? It's a joke to highlight that he or she had been saying that so often. And in this case, I did that exact joke and a bunch of people laughed, but clearly she felt humiliated by it. And someone that her classmates cared about. And so then they rallied around her. And so I think that sometimes you realize times change and maybe that joke worked for 15 years and maybe it'll never work again because now people are a little bit more sensitive for whatever reason. And so we change and evolve over time. There's references that were really funny 10 years ago that no longer work. You got to move on. And so I think that's part of it. But I do want to say one thing, and I think the leader amplification effect, being inspiring, you can talk about your criticism is crushing to people, even like yawn when someone's speaking can be a stab into their stomach when they're giving a really important presentation. But here's the thing. The leader amplification effect can be used to be inspiring. And let me just share one story about this. So whenever I teach about the leader amplification effect, I always give what I call a leader amplification effect call to action. I say, I want you to pick 3 people who have less power than you in your organization. And I want you to genuinely and sincerely, because platitudes are kind of infuriating, is compliment them for something they did, be specific, or express gratitude for how they helped you in a difficult situation. So I was teaching for 50 CEOs and presidents, part of the Young Presidents Organization a few years ago. 10:15, we're going to take a break at 10:30. And I give them this call. And then 10:29, one of the CEOs raises his hand. He says, I've already sent all 3 of my emails. I've already got 3 gushing, effusive responses back that were exhilarating in their tone. And one person said, my spouse has always wanted to go to this new restaurant, and I'm finally going to take her this weekend to celebrate your email. And so there's 2 things I like to point out about my research about this. The first is that I've done research on powerful people. And one of the things my research shows is they tend to be impulsive. And this guy was very impulsive. He couldn't even wait to the break to send his 3 emails. I think the more important thing is it took him almost no time to do. It cost him almost nothing to do, but it had this huge positive impact on people. I was talking to someone once, and I now give a different suggestion. I say, and this was based on a guy named Joseph Stigliano, who's president of a bank with 1,200 employees. And every morning over coffee, he sends birthday greetings to every one of his employees. So it's like 5 a day. And he showed me one of the examples. Hey, Adam, I hope you had a great birthday. How was track and bowling? That's all it says. What is it? Like 11 words. And then he shows me the novel that comes back. Oh my God, bowling was so great. I did this and blah, blah, blah. I now tell people to do this. I said, just over your morning coffee, send it to someone. Could be someone less powerful than you, and that would really amplify it, or someone that you're important to. Could be a spouse, right? It could be a kid. It could be a peer. And just compliment them or say something nice about them. And someone asked me recently, isn't it better to do this in person? And I said, no. Here's why. If you compliment someone in person, they kind of get embarrassed and shy. They don't really know how to respond, right? They kind of look down. They're like, thanks so much. You send it in email, they get to savor it. They get to reread it. But here's the thing that someone told me recently that I thought captured so perfectly. Started doing this. He said, you know what I realized is by sending it by email or text, not only they get to savor it, but they actually send this gushing, effusive email back. He said, so I'm putting a spring in their step. They're actually putting a spring in my step. And so by sending it by email, we both benefit. And so this is one of these examples where I think that it often is good to say things in person. I think a compliment like this is so good because when you're having a hard day, you go back and look at the thing that that person wrote. And even in person, it's great. I write in the book, Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for economics, he said to me one day in passing in 1993, Adam, I love reading your reflection papers. You're a great writer. I think about that 30 years later. That one sentence.
I'm telling you, he was one of my dream gets. Of course, he's now no longer with us, sadly, but even the chair I use, I learned on a podcast that he was on that he uses the same chair that I do, a stressless. And I just think the world of his research, and he and Amos Tversky, we are in perpetual debt. And to think that you received that in 1993, of course, that's evergreen. 32 years later, you can still draw on it.
I also tell in the book that on the first day of class, this is literally my first class as a PhD student at Princeton University, Danny Kahneman scrunches his face, crossed his arms, shook his head and said whatever I had said wasn't right at all.
That's right.
And I didn't speak for another month in his class. So it shows the upside and the
downside of the amplification effect. Yeah, I love that you brought that in. And I can just imagine him saying something like that. And how wonderful that you had a corrective experience. Many people don't. And oftentimes the leader thinks it and thinks the other person knows it, but they don't say it.
Yeah.
And that can be troubling.
It's funny too, because I sent the story to Danny, just wanted him to see it. And he wrote back, you're right, I'm a monster. He said, and I didn't realize it until he actually, at some point when he was a professor, he also started like a little consulting business. And then he had to hire employees. He wasn't teacher to student. It was a different thing. And then he realized how impactful his behavior was on other people.
Wow, so important. I don't know that we've gotten the 3 traits of the infuriating leader. So let's just name them really quick.
Well, the 3 traits of really being infuriating, I think, are being, I would call it pessimistic and pedantic. You just don't see a better world and you just see this small world. You don't see the bigger picture. Another one I think that is really being is the infuriating. So that's being infuriating on the visionary side, being infuriating on the exemplar side. Anxiety infects other people. Again, that leader amplification effect really affects people, your emotions, which is why being calm is so important. But cowardly, I think, is a huge one, right? Not standing up and protecting other people that need protecting. And that leads into being inauthentic and passionless, right? Would be another infuriating thing. And then with the mentor, I think the biggest distinction is generosity being inspiring, selfishness, self-focused, not empowering people, being a micromanager, right? Not elevating people, stealing credit, blaming other people, and then just not empathizing with people, not really taking it. So the inspiring person empowers, they elevate, and they empathize.
So good. There's so many notes I've taken from your book, and reader, you're going to have to buy this book to get to them. You'll get to read about the Dane Kahneman issue. You'll read about an ambiguous message that merely says, I need to talk to you. We'll talk about that in the book. Uncertainty and all of its disturbing, I'm going to call them family members, including when during uncertain times, you talk about the fact that we tend to choose more autocratic leaders during those times, and what we can learn about leadership by the way an ape crosses the road with his group. And believe it or not, it's a pride of lions, but it's a shrewdness of apes. I looked it up. You'll learn more about his wife and what an incredible relationship he's had with her as compared to, and you'll learn more about the wired feeder of a monkey as it relates
the wire mesh monkey.
The wire mesh monkey, who has one of my favorite studies in all of psychology, and it's beautiful and disturbing. And throughout the book, Adam shares really personal information. He's very, very forthcoming about his strengths and warts. And I think that really makes for a great read. Is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet asked before my final question?
In the final chapter, I think I talk a little about something called, for someone who studies relationships and connections, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, you might call them inspiring partnerships. And I give the example of my wife and I. So when I was at Northwestern, I loved Northwestern, but I was miserable. But I was offered a job, a tenure job at Harvard, and I said no. And Berkeley, I said no, and I stayed there. And the reason why I was miserable is I wasn't dating someone at the time. I dated someone for 10 years and we broke up. So I was single, but also I'm not a planner. I don't plan anything. So I spent so much time just sitting at home, doing nothing, etc. And then I met my wife in New York. I moved to New York 3 months later. I met her. And every weekend she was planning something exciting. And she calls herself a curator of experiences. We've traveled all over the world. This summer, we did a 4-week trip for conferences, but Taiwan, Singapore, and Bali. And she'd orchestrated so many different great experiences during that. But my wife isn't the best organizer. So the first international trip she took since we've been married, she's global entry, but she got in the wrong line on the way to London, and she sat there in this long security line when she'd have gone through TSA pre-check. Then when she got back, she got in the wrong line and sat in immigration. She got there. They're like, what are you doing here? You're global entry, just go through. And so I like to say, without my wife, I'd be sitting at home being miserable, doing nothing. And without me, she'd be standing in the wrong line. But together, we are able to have these great experiences. And so I think one of the things just to remember is that one of the ways that we can have better lives and be more inspiring is by teaming up with the people who are really inspiring on maybe the dimensions we're not as strong at. My collaborator, Joe McGee, who I've written so many of my great papers with, he is such a detailed focus, precise, theoretical thinker who cares very deeply about getting the exact right word and making the exact right distinction. And I'm a little bit more hand wavy and, oh, it's all part of a rich tapestry. And so together, right, it comes together and we do great papers together, kind of probably like Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, right?
Exactly.
Papers together.
And I think about Stephen Covey, the classic author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he said he would never hire himself because he has already got himself. He needs somebody who's different. I think about my partnership with my wife. We had come in with very different skill sets. And The Lord of the Ring would not have been The Lord of the Ring if there wasn't a guy who could fire arrows and a guy who could wield a hammer and another guy who could wield magic. So we need different positions. That's beautiful. Well, and just by the way, listener, a few other things. You'll learn about the Good Guy discount, which is absolutely hilarious. You'll learn about leader amplification all the more and the silencing effect of hierarchical societies. There's just so much in this book that you'll be taking notes on, and that will be just the medicine you were looking for. That said, Adam, if you had the power to confer upon all humanity one insight or skill that would dramatically improve the life the individual, and perhaps since we're all connected, including through leadership amplification, others as well. What insight or skill would that be? And how do you imagine it would impact the individual as well as perhaps society at large?
I would probably choose the topic that I've studied the longest in my career, which is perspective taking. So my dissertation, the actual title of my dissertation was Perspective Taking, Debiasing Social Thought. And the capacity to look at the world from someone else's perspective, think about what they're going through, what their motivations are, what's affecting them, is such a powerful way to not get upset at them, but also help solve whatever problem they're going through. As just one example, my mother-in-law has lived with us for 8 years. She is amazing, but she's moving on to a new chapter in her life and she's moving states. And my 8-year-old son, she started living with us the day he was born. It was so close to her. And she went to go visit her new home. And while she was gone, he started being just so mean to me and my wife, but especially my wife. And being able to really take the perspective, Lola's gone. It's really hard for Asher. He's so close to her, but he also can't be mad at her. He can't threaten that relationship. He's furious with her, but he can't express it. And we're safe targets to express it at. And so once I came to that realization, just didn't get as mad at him being mean to me. I could put it into context, right? And realize he's going through a period of transition. It's going to take him a while. Can't do this forever, right? To help him feel his feelings, express his feelings. And so that really requires perspective taking. And perspective taking, like being inspiring, is hard. It's why I think perspective taking is the foundation of being inspiring. It helps us simplify our message. It helps us give people the calm courage that they need. And it helps us empower, elevate, and empathize with others.
I love that so much. And you also give a good case in the book as to why it may even improve our own creativity. So this is just a really important well to drink out of. I couldn't thank you enough for writing the book, for sharing your wisdom with my listeners. Adam, this has been a blast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I had as much fun as you did.
Oh, right on. This is Dr. Adam Dorsay thanking you for listening to SuperPsyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.